Good morning. Thank you for coming to our office, National Council of Resistance of Iran. Today, I would like to talk about the 2020 parliamentary elections in Iran that is going to take place starting tonight. And there has been 3 major uprisings in Iran in January 2018, November 2019, and January 2020, this year, shaking the foundations of the Iranian regime. The population has risen against the rampant corruption, economic mismanagement, lack of freedoms. Inflation and unemployment are at all-time high. Tehran's quote-unquote strategic depth in Iraq and Lebanon is shattered, as the population in those countries are pushing the regime out of their countries. International sanctions are only increasing, and Tehran's oil exports are close to none. These circumstances have made it an easy decision for the Iranian population to boycott the election, and has left the regime with tough, impossible choices to make to survive. Given the increasing deadly impasse of Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, he is confronted with 2 choices. The first is to close ranks even more while adopting a more aggressive posture toward the United States and carry out more internal purges and suppression. The second option Khamenei has is to lessen the conflict with the US and accept some of the 12 points announced by Secretary Mike Pompeo, which would involve showing flexibility and tolerance at home that Khamenei cannot even do that. Based on the internal deliberations, the regime has decided to close ranks and carry out a complete purge during the elections for 3 main reasons. Number 1 is Khamenei is really in fear of recent uprising in Iran. The regime is terrified that any splinters within the ruling elite would fuel more uprising and conversely would deepen internal schism, tearing away individuals who are not completely subservient and loyal to the regime. Khamenei, for second reason, which is the fear of the MEK and the Iran opposition, National Council of Resistance of Iran, which MEK would exploit its internal schism in the era of popular uprising and facilitate the regime's overthrow. And number 3 is Khamenei, in fear of the United States. Regime is worried that any schism would aggravate the regime's susceptibility in its standoff with the US. Although all factions of the regime, including Rouhani, Khamenei, are urging or even threatening the population to participate in these sham elections, the voter turnout is anticipated to be radically lower than even previous shams elections and previous rounds. The expected low voter turnout has already caused a serious crisis for Khamenei and the Iranian regime. In our understanding, 3 factors are contributing to lower voter turnout. Number 1 is the explosive state of the Iranian society and extensive disenchantment of the population with the regime, as well as the November uprising, which led to the massacre of at least 1,500 demonstrators. Number two is Rouhani have made so many lies and absolutely shown his loyalty to Khamenei, and that created turning away even those who voted for him for a hope of so-called moderation. And number three is the expansion of resistant units of MEK inside Iran and their active calls for a boycott, which have some of pictures on the walls of boycotting in every street, in every locations in Iran. So I want to make it very short, and I would like my colleague, Mr. Jafarzadeh, to come and elaborate on some details of the elections. Who are the candidates that are actually running for the parliament? What the measures that the Iranian regime have taken to prevent any potential protest during these sham elections, as well as elaborating on the role of the resistance units that have called for the boycott of election in almost all cities around Iran. And at the end of this briefing, he will answer some of your questions. Mr. Jafarzadeh, please join me.
Hello, everybody. Let's see if I can get this here. Hello, everybody. As she said, my name is Alireza Jafarzadeh. I'm the Deputy Director of the Washington office of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, and welcome to all of you here to our office. And what I would like to do before I go through more details about this sham election, I want to say a few words about the measure that was announced just minutes ago by the Special Representative for Iran at the United States Department of State, Mr. Brian Hook, who announced, and also the Treasury Department, that a number of individuals associated with the Guardian Council and those who are involved in purging the candidates and practically implementing the regime's policies of making the elections meaningless, designating them today. That's, in fact, a welcome step in the right direction. Having said that, what I would like to do is basically to highlight what she basically said, that it's so important. I don't think we can talk enough about the differences between this election and all the other previous elections, because the regime for the past 40 years has had, like, every 4 years, these so-called parliamentary elections, and this is the 11th one. But none of those prior elections have had this level of a crisis created for the regime. The three major uprisings in 2 years ago, and then in November, and then January. Think about it. Just 2 months ago, the regime was firing on the peaceful demonstrators who were just basically demanding their economic rights, their political rights, and then when they were confronted with bullets and killing them one by one by the regime's sharpshooters from the roofs, from other places. And under these circumstances, what would election mean? And what's the whole purpose of going to the ballot box and casting your vote when you expressed it, you got bullets in return? Adding to that is the high inflation, the unemployment. It's at all-time high. And most recent case was the shooting down the passenger plane, Ukrainian passenger plane, and then lying about it for 3 days until the whole thing was exposed, and they had no other choice but to come out. And then after that, they went after the families of the victims who wanted accountability. And then think about it, that This time the regime doesn't have its number two, Qasem Soleimani, who was both involved in just about anything that was related to keeping the regime in power, from suppressing the demonstrators to even in terms of the elections. It was the IRGC commanders who've been involved in what they call election engineering, which I will elaborate a little bit more, to the regime's operations in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and other places. And then, economically speaking, the regime is really absolutely desperate, and in terms of not having the ability to export their oil, and that explains partly for their trouble in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and other places. Now, that's why the regime, you use the Guardian Council as a purging tool. Interestingly, the Guardian Council, some of their members, including the head, Ahmad Jannati, who got designated. And what they basically did with the candidates, more than roughly about half of them have been disqualified. There's only one rule. It doesn't matter which faction they're coming from. If they're not compliant with the supreme leader, and if they're not fully compliant with the interests of the regime, keeping the regime in power, and the agencies that run it, they're considered a threat, and they need to be disqualified, as they did. Even those sitting members of the regime's own parliament who were qualified by the Guardian Council 4 years ago, if the circumstances changed based on their interpretation, they're out. So there have been dozens of sitting parliamentary members of the regime who've been disqualified. And as my colleague Ms. Samsami mentioned earlier, the regime, Supreme Leader Khamenei, decided, instead of opening up the society and trying to solve the problems that way, he has gone the other direction, closing the ranks. And this has been his decision over the past 2 years. Right after the December 2017 and January 2018 uprising, that was the path that the regime took, and they have continued that path. And the more developments shape up, the more the regime is emphasizing on closing the ranks, because the number one fear that the regime has is the uprising, and those who are organizing the uprising and who are leading the uprising, who are sharpening the message of the uprising and ensuring the continuity of the uprising. And then, of course, the regime is afraid of the international community, the sanctions, and all of that coming. So that basically explains that. Now, I want to take a few minutes and just elaborate a little bit on, who are these candidates that the regime is trying to get back to the parliament, or like new members to get to the parliament. There are a good number of them, a significant number of them, have serious backgrounds, whether it's the IRGC, as high as like brigadier generals of the IRGC, who have now taken the role of putting themselves up for candidacy, and then, or the Quds Force commanders or the Besiege, who are involved in the suppression of the population in the country, the MIS agents or officials or directors, as well as those within the judiciary who've been involved in the killings of the Iranian people and the political prisoners over the years. These are the candidates that survive the screening process of the Guardian Council. And that's why when the people see that the same Revolutionary Guards or their associates who were just shooting at them a few weeks ago in the street, killing them, they're now seeking the vote of the same population to put them back in the parliament. And that explains why there is absolutely no interest whatsoever on the part of the Iranian population to give any credibility to this sham process, what they call elections. Now, let's just take a look at a few of those names, and we have further details of that in those packages that you can have. This is one of the their superstars, Amir Hayat Muqaddam, an IRGC Brigadier General, and he's been there in Khuzestan province, and interestingly, he's coming from the city of Mashhad. Everyone knows about Mashhad now, that's the city that in November was the scene of one of the most horrible massacres, that over 100 people in a matter of few minutes actually were murdered in Mashhad. And he has such a long track record of being on top of just about anything within the repressive agencies, the IRGC, but also he was the governor of Khuzestan. He was the head of the various sections of the IRGC, but also having a hand in business. Osman Airline is a profitable business, and he's on the board, and that's how you make money in this regime. So that's like one of the candidates, and the other one is Sayyid Muhammad Jawad Abtahi Furushani. He comes from Khomeini Shahr, and he was a member of parliament in the 8th parliament and the 10th, which is the current one. And he's really a staunch supporter of Khamenei. He's the one who actually brought an American flag in the parliament and just burned it there without even thinking what to do with the ashes and everything, just dropping it on the carpet. These are the kind of people who are seeking the vote of the Iranian population, and for sure, the people reject them. Another person, one of the most ruthless IRGC commanders, Brigadier General Mansour Haqiqatpour. He comes from the city of Ardabil. He was the commander of the Quds Force Directorate 5000, which this unit is has been very active in the region, including in Azerbaijan, and so he was before he was a member of parliament, but the last parliament he wasn't elected. So the IRGC is now fully behind him, trying to put him back in the regime's parliament. This guy, Said Ali Aghazadeh Dafsari, is from Rasht. He's a former parliamentary besieged and the IRGC State Security Forces commander. And 2 parliaments ago, he was a member of the National Security and Foreign Affairs Committee, and he's trying to get back again in the parliament. Then you have Kazem Dabir, who was one of the most radical besieged members in the 1990s and 2000, and then he was working very closely with the commanders of the besieged in suppressing the population in Ardabil and other places. He's now also has become a candidate from there. And he was the governor of Sarain, which is a city near Ardabil. Another person is Habib Aghajari. He is also from Mashhad. Where that notorious killing took place 2 parliaments ago, in the 9th parliament. He was a deputy there, and he was the deputy commander of the IRGC's Navy force during the Iran-Iraq War, and the deputy commander of IRGC combat forces, combat operations, and then also the Inspector General of the IRGC Navy. He's the commander of the Fajr 46th Brigade, the Kosar Destroyer Brigade, a long history of operations, terrorist operations, involved in the war and all of that in the IRGC, and now he puts on a suit and representing Mashhad, where he was involved in endorsing and the killing of those innocent people. Now here's another very interesting person whom they say like he's the young generation of Iranians who want to get to the parliament. Let's look at this young generation to see who they are. This guy, his name is Said Mohsen Dehnavi. He was actually endorsed by the Khamenei faction because in Tehran there were like 6 to 7 different factions of Khamenei who were trying to introduce a list of candidates. They need to have 30 lists of candidates, and they couldn't agree upon. They would go, they had like dozens of lists, a total of over 120 members, and eventually they trimmed it down, and he made that list. And look, how he's posted his picture next to Mohammad Baqir Ghalibaf, the former chief of the police, former the airspace force commander of the IRGC, former mayor of Tehran, police chief, and all that, and also former presidential candidate just last time. And he's the front runner of the Khamenei pro-Khamenei factions, posting Said Mohsen Dehnavi's picture next to him. And now, what's interesting about him is that, well, he was the head of the student Besiege force at Sharif University of Technology. Now, Sharif University of Technology is one of the most active universities, top universities in Iran. There were 3 top universities in Iran from the time of the Shah: Sharif University of Technology, Tehran University, and Tehran, what they call Polytechnic, is now called Amir Kabir University. And he got in there and he became the head of the Besiege. Besiege at the university means those who go after the students, those who spy on the students, try to identify them, target them, disallow any kind of political activities, disrupt their gatherings, their meetings, and even physically charging at them. And this is, Dehnavi right here, yelling and screaming, trying to disrupt the meeting of the students at Sharif University of Technology. And here's another picture of him with the same posture and targeting this other student here. And he made his way up in gaining key positions within the regime, getting the attention of the supreme leader himself and the regime's president. He became like the deputy of the scientific research for the Ministry of Science. And in 2008, he spoke before Khamenei. Khamenei was there speaking for a group of people. He was like, supposedly representing those to speak before Khamenei. And he got the attention of Khamenei, and that he asked for Khamenei to give his traditional scarf that he always has on his shoulder. And Khamenei asked his assistant to take it off his shoulder and give it to him. Look how jubilant he is to get that. You can see like the relationship between him and Khamenei. Now, interestingly, he's the guy who posed as a researcher. He's a cancer researcher. He's a good person who's trying to help the health situation and all of that. And he tried to actually make his way to the United States. In 2017, in July 2017, he landed at Boston Logan Airport with the admission on the J1 visa, supposedly trying to do some research at a Boston Children's Hospital and in connection with Harvard University. And then the customs, U.S. Customs, after holding him for hours, they returned him back to Iran, saying that he just doesn't qualify to be in the United States. And then there was like huge campaign by pro-regime elements that, raising hell that, he's a doctor, he wants to help people, and this is helping medicine, all of that. These are the kind of people that the regime tries to get into this country and take advantage and learn the know-how. Especially his focus is nanotechnology, and that's a very advanced, sophisticated technology that, of course, U.S. is on top of the world on that, and any kind of capability. He actually said that they were weak on that, and his idea that was approved by the highest levels within the regime was to send him here and basically steal the technology and the know-how and go back and help the regime. Now, in your package, you will see a list of about over 50 people who were, we just gave a little bit of background about them. These are some of the candidates who are, have a high chance of actually getting into the parliament. And just look at their background. All of them, almost all of them, are either IRGC commanders, MIS commanders. I don't know if you have these packets. If not, you should get it. They will share it with you. It's in there just to get a better sense of who these guys are. On top of the list, actually, there is this Abdurreza Mesri from Kermanshah. He was a deputy in the 7th, 9th, and the 10th Parliament, and he was a former member of the IRGC. He became ambassador to Venezuela, and then came back and he became a member of the judiciary. He was a member of the Death Commission in 1988, who were sentencing people to death, political prisoners. Primarily the members of the main Iranian opposition, the Mujahideen Khalq, were the main target of that infamous massacre. And in Kermanshah, he was the top person. We had exposed him in our book, Iran Where Mass Murderers Rule, back in December 2017. And he's now a candidate running, trying to represent Kermanshah. By the way, Kermanshah was one of the places which had a very high number of the those who had fallen for freedom during the uprising in November of last year, and he's trying to portray it as though he wants to represent that population. And there is a long list of them here. Lots of interesting details about that. I urge you all to take a look at that. Having said that. We believe, based on all the circumstances that are on the ground, based on what we mentioned earlier, and also based on this very interesting poll that was done by the regime itself. The original idea was to figure out, who is pro so-called reformer, pro principalist, but the outcome was astonishing to them, and that's why they don't talk about it, and they just removed it afterwards. And they took a poll of actually person-to-person interview with people of over 1,000 people. And these were only the people who responded to their questions. There was another 1,000 who said they didn't want to make a comment. You would assume that those who didn't want to make comment, they fall under the category of, the none. And only 14% of them said they would vote for the reformers, and 11 said for the hardliners, and 75% said for none. And most of those people said they wouldn't even participate in the election. Based on just this statistic, you just add up the numbers, you're talking about roughly 9-10% of that. But in reality, based on what we see, and even based on this own poll itself, is no more than 5% voter participation. That puts the eligible voters announced by the regime are 58 million. So that 5%, you do the math, is 3 to 4 million, the most. But wait until the regime makes the announcements. They are going to, the plan is definitely going to be over 60 or 70% voter participation. That's been their strategy all along, and they've always done that. And we feel that, as I said earlier, the main reason that you will see a very, very low voter turnout and probably boycott of the elections would be first the uprising, and then the activities of the resistance units of the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, inside the country. They've been very busy, not only during the uprising, who were involved in the uprising and leading the activities, but also sharpening the message, keeping the focus and ensuring the continuity, but also during the elections, and even prior to that, when Qasem Soleimani was killed, they were involved in tearing down the pictures of Qasem Soleimani, burning his pictures. Actually, Secretary Pompeo said that Qasem Soleimani is so hated by the people of Iran that people are actually burning his own pictures. And of course, these resistance units have been very active in doing that. I just put like only a few sample pictures of these more recent activities. This was just last week on the 15th of February. The pictures of the leaders of the resistance that it says the sentence under those pictures says, "My vote is regime change." That's the thing. Actually, the most popular hashtag now related to elections is hashtag "My vote is regime change." So that's some samples of activity. This is Mrs. Rajavi's picture with her message saying that boycotting the sham elections is a national duty, and our commitment to the martyrs of the uprising. Because when you have that uprising and all the people were killed at the time, participating in the election is actually denying that fact and is a total disrespect for those who gave their lives for freedom in Iran. Here's another picture of Mrs. Rajavi hanging from in Karaj, another place where major uprisings had taken place. You can see her picture here, and this is the bridge. And then what it says on the sign, it says, "Killing and imprisonment will not stop the uprising." So these are the things, these activities have been going on for weeks and weeks. This is a pretty recent gathering at Amir Kabir University, one of those three top major universities that have been engulfed in anti-regime demonstrations even at the time of the Shah. And this is the chant that the students are making: "Neither ballots nor boxes, boycott the elections." So that's a widespread call by not just the students, but by all the sectors of the Iranian society. So for that matter, what the regime has done, they're trying to do like preventive measures. They're so concerned that this election sham tomorrow could actually potentially turn into whatever, because a lot of times when the spark comes, it's unpredictable, or even at the times that they predicted, like the increase of the oil, gasoline prices, still they didn't manage to do it. So they're in full alert. Both the IRGC and the Basij are tasked with providing security for the elections, and they're coordinating with the Ministry of Intelligence. And they're also on full alert since February 15. And all the furloughs have been canceled, and the anti-riot forces are on high alert. And their goal is to prevent any gatherings that could lead to any kind of protest by the people. And then also they have these patrol cars in the streets with their sirens on, creating an atmosphere of fear and just making their presence known, hoping that this would deter the population. That didn't work very well during the November uprising in over 200 cities across the country. Despite their overt and brutal presence, they still couldn't prevent the uprising from taking shape or continuing. And then also the police stations are actually ordered to arrest anyone who are suspicious that they have their bikes without a plate, or they're checking their ID cards, and any movement after 11:30 p.m. until 5 a.m. They're asking for the ID cards because they're afraid a lot of actions, actually, as you saw in some of those pictures, actually does take place during the night. So they're trying to prevent that, and the soldiers and the RGC people in garrisons and military places, they're forced to bring their birth certificates because they want to line them all up to go and vote. Now, having said that, let me just say a few words about what I mentioned earlier about the election engineering. This is the process. We talked about it before as well. During the other elections, this is something that the regime has been doing since over a decade ago. The elections is a very, very careful process that the regime is pursuing. Our information from inside the Iranian regime shows that what the regime is focusing on, especially Khamenei, is relying heavily on this, what they call engineering process, in election engineering process. So all the three major branches of the government, judiciary, the executive, and the legislative branch are involved in it. And what they want to do, this time they want to make sure that no matter what that person, which faction they belong to, they want to make sure that there is no one who does not fully believe in Khamenei and the system in their heart. And that certainly includes most of the people in their own faction. So what they do, in every province, there is a unit in charge of that that is consisted of the commanders of the top commander of Revolutionary Guard in that province, and then you have the representative of the supreme leader in that province. Then you have the IRGC intelligence security protection of that province. Then you have the head of the intelligence organization of the IRGC in that province, who all sit together and figure out what to do. And it doesn't start just like, a couple of weeks before the elections. They start working on this from long ago, months and months, sometimes a year or two before, figuring out for next parliamentary elections who is going to be their candidates and how they need to do to groom that person, to elevate him, to make sure that just monitor him if he is the right person, and just building momentum for the person, gaining recognition, making sure he attends a number of events and ceremonies and here and there to give him some kind of visibility locally. And then they put that person on the list. So if someone showed up that you never heard the name, it's not that he just decided to run for office from such and such city or town or village. This is all entirely orchestrated by the regime, primarily by the Revolutionary Guards, because 70% of the voting stations in the country are actually under the control of the IRGC and the Basij. It's true that the Interior Ministry is in charge of the whole process of the elections. They are the ones who determine, where the voting stations and all of that will be. But the people who are actually carrying out and manning those stations are actually IRGC and the Basij forces. They are the same people who are there, who bring the ballot boxes, who are there. These are the same people who help people to write those ballot boxes, ballot papers, some of whom may not be literate, and also the same people who monitor the boxes, and then the same people who would read the votes. You probably saw that Rouhani actually talked about it, saying that every person who goes to ballot, they have to vote twice, like two papers, and then somebody would read the paper saying, okay, Mr. So-and-so, and then somebody else would listen to that guy and mark Mr. So-and-so in front of that, ticking in front of that name. And then, so he was saying, like, how do we know, like, whether he reads it correctly? And then if you mention such a name, whether the person who marks it, these are all human beings who are doing it, it's not electronic, he marks somebody else's name. And then at the end of the day, when they want to count the votes, and they do it again manually, and if the name is not very clear, like who that person is, they may say, okay, if they don't like the person, okay, it's not legible, it's not a valid paper. Or if it is not clear, well, this may be like, it sounds like Mr. Mohammadi, so they put it there. So it's a very sophisticated thing from step 1 to 10. all of that is actually under the control of the IRGC and the Basij. So the whole election process, after these candidates go through the disqualification process by the Guardian Council, even the voting system is under direct control of the IRGC and the Revolutionary Guards. And then eventually, after the what they call the tally process of the votes, when they bring all the numbers, they don't just announce that. They have all of these people sit together and figure out what is the number that they're going to announce. And they do it all the time. And all of the factions of the regime are in agreement. Usually, they multiply it 4 to 5 times. So if it's like 113,000 votes, you know, they multiply it by 4 or 5 and say, okay, 600,000 or whatever the number is. And then that's how the vote turnout is always within the same range of 60, 70, 75, 65, 55% of the voter turnout. And we expect the same situation to be the same this time, even though the numbers, the actual physical presence of the voters will actually be lower, but still the plan is to not announce any low numbers. Now, what's the step, what the US should do? It's very important that the international community, especially the United States, to call the elections what it is, a sham. It's a welcome step that was taken today by the US government, sanctioning some of those people in the Council of Guardians, including Jannati, is one of the most notorious elements within the regime, who's been in charge of anything repressive, anything that involves the taking away the rights of the Iranian people. It's a welcome step by the US government. And then no matter what the regime is going to announce, the actions should continue to be the gauge for the regime, not who gets into parliament. I can assure you in advance that the next parliament is going to be under the full control of the Supreme Leader Khamenei. And I can easily do the math because there are 160 seats that are what they consider here safe seats, because there is no other opponent from other faction. They're all already disqualified, or there were like maybe one opponent from the other faction in that district is gone. So 160 seats already we know will go to Khamenei. That's enough because the parliament has only 290 members. All you need is like 146. So that's assured. The question is, okay, who's going to be the next speaker of the parliament? Most probably, as you saw that picture, Ghalibaf is being groomed by the regime to take the helm from Ali Larijani, who's not running this time. And he's a staunch supporter of Khamenei. So nothing is really going to change, and you're going to continue to see the domination of the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei through the parliament. This has been the case over and over the past few years. Having said that, what we need to see is really firmness and decisiveness in dealing with the Iran regime, because these elections will not change anything. The only thing they do, they actually may create opportunity to show the world how unpopular this regime is, how isolated it is, how the Iranian people have no faith whatsoever in the political system in Iran. And it's really time for the United States to recognize what the people have been chanting in the streets of Iran for months and months and months. And that's, they're recognizing their right to change the repressive regime with their own hands and seek a republic based on a free vote of the Iranian people, based on the suppression of religion and state, and based on pluralism, justice, and equality. That's all really the international community need to do. Hold the regime accountable for their outlaw behavior, build up more and more pressure on the Iranian regime to take away their resources that is being used for suppression at home and terrorism abroad, and side with the people of Iran as they are striving for change in the country. Thank you very much. This is basically the end of our briefing. We're more than happy to respond to your questions. Any questions you may have, please raise your hand. There is a microphone here. Introduce yourself, and we'd love to hear from you. Any questions? Yes, please, Mike.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you for your excellent presentation, shedding light on the facts that we often do not have. Given the press coverage, I'm Sophie Saidi, Dr. Saidi from University of Baltimore. Most recent, I just want to make a quick, very brief statement and then ask my question on that basis. Freedom House has the most recent report on country reports of the worldwide reports that it has regarding Iran, and is indicating in its most recent report that out of an index of between 0 to 100, Iran is number 18, the least free country, also indicating by facts and documentation that there is zero civil liberties, zero freedoms, political freedoms, as well as I indicated, civil liberties. So at any level, it's an unfree country. To what extent, here's a question, these are the facts that are known, in addition to the fact that you indicated this is sham elections, an unelected perpetual supreme leader like Khamenei is electing institutions completely on his own. So my question is generally, given the facts that we have and what you've laid out today, how, what is the ramifications of, let's say, U.S. officials like Senator Murphy, for instance, dealing with Zarif on the sidelines of media conference, or does that lend any credibility? Is that of any help? And also, let's say foreign ministers of Netherlands and Austria visiting Iran from European side. What are the ramifications, given the context of information that we have and what you laid out here regarding the Iranian government? I really appreciate your comments.
Thank you so much. Appreciate both your comments and also the question you posed. To be specific, certainly visits, meetings with the American officials or members of Congress, with the representatives of the world's leading state sponsor of terror and the major killer of the Iranian population is an appalling act. Is not only immoral and inappropriate to do that, it certainly should be condemned, but also politically speaking, what kind of a message are these senators or anyone who does that are trying to send? The message is sent to the repressive rulers of Iran is that you can just proceed with your killings and we will continue to have dialogue with you. The message to the people of Iran would be that no matter how many people get killed, we're still going to consider those repressive rulers as your interlocutors of that nation, instead of those nations being represented by the people and their organized resistance. Speaking of Javad Zarif, we just put out a book. It's called Iran's Emissaries of Terror. That we have a copy right there, and the book chronicles a whole history of terror operations by the Iran regime's embassies all over the world, from Europe to other places. And I'm not talking about decades ago, which there is a long list of it there. Appreciate that. Thank you. But I'm talking about the more recent ones. Thank you. About the more recent ones, just in the past 2 years. This is the book that lists so many operations by the Minister of Intelligence conducted through the embassies of the Iranian regime in Europe and other places. 7 Iranian regime so-called diplomats, they are actually diplomat terrorists, were expelled by European nations in the past 2 years, including an ambassador in Albania, and several others are arrested. Another diplomat, Astollah Assadi, is now in jail in Belgium because he physically delivered a very high explosive bomb that was used, the same kind of bomb that was used in the bombing of the Brussels airport, to two other culprits to take it to Paris, to a large gathering of as many as 100,000 people who were there to listen to the leader of the president-elect of the Iranian resistance, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, and then of course they were caught. Right here in the United States, the people who worked with Zarif's UN mission and the Minister of Intelligence were plotting terror and espionage here against the officials of the Iranian resistance. Two of them were arrested in August of 2018 by the FBI. They confessed to their crime, that they were spying for the Iranian regime, and they're now in jail. So when Javad Zarif actually represents a very recent list of all those terrorist activities that he and his diplomats have been involved, and also Javad Zarif was the guy who was explaining away the lies of the Iran regime when they downed the Ukrainian passenger plane and lied for 3 days. And Javad Zarif is the same guy who's been meeting with the Hassan Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah, and Assad, the killer of the Syrian people. So he represents a repressive regime, and what's the whole purpose of meeting him? And one might say, well, we said in the meeting that you shouldn't do terror operations in here and there. Well, you don't need to meet to make those things. Those demands were already made in the 12-point plan demand of Secretary Pompeo, that the Iran regime has to end its terror operations in Syria, in Iraq, and other places. It has to end threatening other nations. There is a long list of it. So why would a senator or meet with Javad Zarif? That only legitimizes this regime, that they still consider Zarif as a representative of a repressive regime, but still dealing with them. And no wonder that the Iran regime media have been using this for the past 2 days. All the major media, including the media run by the IRGC, Fars News Agency, saying, yes, Zarif is meeting with the representatives of the American nation, trying to create a divide here. To the country, what you want to do, it doesn't matter whether someone is a Democrat or Republican. This is not a partisan issue. What you need to do, you need to send a very strong message of firmness and decisiveness and accountability to the rulers, repressive rulers of Iran. And you want to send a message to the people of Iran that we are on your side. We hear you. We see your demands as legitimate. It's the same Congress that just, the House passed H.R. 752 that called for the rights of the Iranian people, defending them, condemn all of those killings. So you don't want to go against that. So any such actions are clearly not helpful, should be condemned, and should be stopped. The world needs to realize that there is a whole new reality regarding Iran. And that's the uprising by the vast majority of the people of Iran. The people of Iran want change, and they will make it happen. All the outside world need to do is to stand on the right side and do the right thing, do their own responsibility in putting the pressure on the Iran regime and recognizing the rights of the Iranian people. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Yes, please. Zach. Can you get the microphone?
Zachary Al-Shek, Watching Examiner. I was just wondering, I know there's folks on the ground encouraging boycotts of
Yes.
the election. Do you anticipate there to be any protests, like a new wave of protests following this election? And if so, are those folks on the ground also encouraging demonstrations and protests in addition to the boycotts?
Well, the focus of the campaign that they're doing on the ground at this time is entirely focused on the boycotting the elections. But as I said earlier, anything could happen, anything could go in any direction. And they're certainly on their toes in terms of doing what they need to do in leading the activities, and ensuring continuity and showing directions. When you have resistance units whose really job is to help the people of Iran change this regime on their own, The rest is really up to the regime, what kind of avenues it allows you. The regime can avoid all of these things and recognize the right of the people of Iran for their freedom of expression, their rights and votes and all of that. And we've said times and over that if the regime would agree to free elections under the auspices of the United Nations, not under the Velayat Faqih rule, everyone, long ago we have made that. But we're way past that. I mean, that era is over. The regime has not gone that direction. The country is going to the opposite direction. So what happens next, I think, primarily depends on what the regime would decide to do. But when it comes to the resistance units, when it comes to the activities of the youth in Iran, they are fully prepared and they're thinking only and only about one thing, and that's changing this regime. Any other questions? Howard.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, Howard LaFranchi, Christian Science Monitor. I'm wondering, since the Denavi case in 2017, there have been more recent cases of Iranians with student visas being denied entry and sent back. And I'm wondering if your organization has a position on that, if your sentiment now in terms of, as you were just saying, that senators shouldn't be meeting with members of the regime. So is it? Do you also extend that to that any contact or any openness to other Iranians should also be cut off at the moment?
Thank you, Howard, for the question. Let me first clarify one thing. There's one thing is the Iranians and the Iranian people, and the other one is the Iranian regime. And it's perfectly fine and encouraged for any Americans, any European nationals, other nationals, to be engaged with the Iranian people and their resistance and everybody else. But when it comes to the regime itself or those who are associated with it, whether officially or unofficially, that's where the red line is. And we don't have like a blanket policies saying like do this, do that. But what is very clear for us is that you need to make sure that the Iran regime's agents, no matter what cover they use, I mean, this guy, when he came, his cover was like, they posed him as a cancer researcher from Sharif University of Technology. That's a very prestigious university in Iran. He just wants to, in connection with Harvard, to do some research. On the face of it, it looks pretty benign. But you need to really understand how the Iran regime operates. Look at the whole track record of the Iran regime's advancement of their nuclear weapons program and conducting their terror operations. When it comes to the nuclear weapons program, we know a thing or two about it because we've been doing that for over 2 decades. And we have found that almost all of the work the regime had done were under the cover companies that they did, like for instance, Natanz itself was under the cover of a project for eradication of desert. They had a whole host of different front companies who were like laser enrichment was done under the cover of medical use. This is like a medical facility that they're doing radiation for medical purposes, but in fact that was where the heart of the laser enrichment program for the nuclear weapons program was. All of that was under that cover. We exposed in 2003 a site in Tehran that it was covered like as a watchmaking factory that we gave the information, and eventually that's one of the places that they found highly enriched uranium traces even after the regime had cleaned it up. So we shouldn't be beguiled by those things. It's not that we're saying, don't have students or anything like that. What we're saying is that be careful. The Iranian regime needs those, the expertise, the technology. Every week there is a case that the law enforcement agencies in this country are arresting individuals who are funneling expertise and technology from various places to Iran illegally, going around the sanctions. Especially after the sanctions, the regime is really, really focused on that. And this case, like nanotechnology, is one of the key technologies that the regime has been focusing on. That's part and parcel of their nuclear weapons program, that they want to perfect that technology. So I would say that you have to look at it case by case. Any kind of connection with the Iranian regime, and there are so many ways you can see there, like the red flag, and find out about that. That's not very difficult for them. The fact that as soon as this guy was stopped at the airport, the entire Iranian regime lobby were talking about it, clearly showed that all the coordinations that was already done, how the whole process of perhaps applying to come here was done through the whole network. The Iranian regimes, all of their ministries were out. The ministers took a position right away. All of the top people of the regime talked about it. So this is not just like a student who wants to register at the university academic institution here. These are, agents of the Iranian regime who work for the IRGC, who work for the Ministry of Intelligence, and who work for the military of the Iranian regime for different purposes. So I would say, especially now, you really need to call upon everybody to really scrutinize the regime's extensive operations they have here from Boston to California to all over the places. Especially academic institutions are very vulnerable to this kind of infiltration of the Iranian regime into their system. Thank you, Howard. Anybody else? Any other questions? Okay. I'd like to thank everybody. Make sure to get your booklet, your package before you go. And thank you for coming.